FrameGen, the technology equivalent of a fondant cake. It looks great in screenshots, but the moment that you put it in your mouth, it feels like there's some drywall vomiting into your soul. I actually learned about the concept of betrayal as a child via fondant cake. Just don't cover it in fondant and the cake would be so much better. You're just ruining it. And it's exactly the same with games and FrameGen. And don't get me wrong, it's an impressive technology. The fact that they can essentially fake a bunch of frame rate feels like magic. But it's got a glaring Achilles heel, which is the latency problem. But Nvidia just launched the beta of their new DLSS 4.5 FrameGen. So in today's video, we'll see if they fix the latency problem by instead of multiplying the base frame rate by 4, just multiplying it with 6. I don't know, I feel like intuitively that should make the problem worse, but that's what we're gonna find out in today's video. Before we get into that, however, now if you've watched this channel before, you'll know that I love buying refurbished. That's why today's video is sponsored by Corsair's Refurbished and Revival series gaming PCs. These are professionally restored performance-ready systems, which you can save up to 40% on compared to buying new. All Vengeance series refurbished systems come in excellent condition, so will look and feel brand new. Whereas Revival series also covers good condition, so might have a few blemishes. And if you're unhappy with the condition, it's covered by Corsair's 60-day return window. So save yourself a bunch of money on a Corsair gaming PC using the link down below. Now, in order to test the new DLSS number go up, I'm going to use an RTX 5050 for this, which is technically the lowest end GPU that supports this new technology, which I think makes it the best candidate for testing it because, well, it's the GPU that needs it the most. And I'm testing it with a system inside Corsair's shiny new 3500D case and a new Intel Core Ultra 7 whatever CPU. So regardless of what happens, we shouldn't run into a CPU bottleneck. But with that, let's get to the testing. Now, DLSS 4.5 FrameGen is still in beta, so in order to get access to it, you have to enable beta features in your Nvidia app, at which point it will download and install an update enabling the feature. Once you've enabled the beta, you'll get a couple more options under FrameGen mode. Now, you've got the standard options of global and use 3D settings and fixed, except now with games that are compatible, it jumps all the way up to 6x. Like I've been saying this whole video, I don't think the multiplier is the issue, but maybe 6 is the one that fixes the latency issue. But what they also added was dynamic, which I think was a pretty good move because it lets you pin the frame generation to the refresh rate of your monitor or to a custom frame rate. But your monitor refresh rate makes a lot of sense to me because then the software figures out how much it needs to frame gen or whatever. We are going to test that later in the video, but for most of the testing, I am going to use fixed so that we have control of all of the variables. But for now, we're not going to enable any of it. We're just going to launch Cyberpunk. So at 1080p Ultra, we are kind of hovering in the mid 60s to I've seen it jump to about 80, depending on where we're looking. In terms of latency, we're hovering at around 15 milliseconds. It does jump to 18 occasionally, but with this kind of input latency, the game feels fine at 70 frames per second. This is a solid feeling experience. So the starting point is reasonable for a game like Cyberpunk. Now in Cyberpunk settings, it doesn't let us go all the way up to 6x. 4x is the max. I guess this is because we're still technically using beta drivers at this point. But I think we're gonna start with 2x. We've gone from, around 70 frames per second to about 100 frames per second. So it hasn't doubled the frame rate, but that's fine. Straight off the bat, the game actually feels a little heavier. Like, there's always this weird dissonance for me with FrameGen gameplay because it looks like we've got 100 frames per second happening, but it doesn't quite feel like it. It feels kind of like 60 frames per second. In fact, we've gained latency. Not a huge amount, but we've gone from between 16 to 18 to 17 to 22 milliseconds. And remember, if we were natively rendering at 100 frames per second, that latency would have dropped down to around 10 milliseconds. It also doesn't look great. Having said all of that, I can imagine that if you're somebody that plays games more casually and you haven't been playing hardcore shooters online against real people, this latency isn't going to be a big deal for you. You're going to be like, wow, the game looks smoother and it still feels fine. This is a reasonable experience. Now with 4x, we have gained significant smoothness. The game looks a lot more smooth than it did before, but it's running at about 180 frames per second. But what's also happened is we've gained even more latency. At points, it jumps to 35 milliseconds, which again, isn't crazy high latency, but considering that we're seeing with our eyes 170 frames per second worth of smoothness, it's weird. There's a dissonance here. Like, you can see it's not terrible. I mean, it's better than gaming on a MacBook display, for example, in terms of input latency. But we've got the equivalent latency of the game running at 30 frames per second. So it feels like 30 frames per second while we're seeing 180. But what I'm curious to see is if the new DLSS 4.5 frame gen adds additional latency on top of what the 4x already does. Now, the first thing you'll notice, aside from the 240 frames per second that we're pretending to have right now, is that we're using preset A here. Now, preset A is the kind of standard frame generation model. Apparently, they do have a preset B, which increases the visual fidelity of the frame gen, but we're starting out with preset A to see what it does, and we're seeing more latency. It's jumped to 43 milliseconds. In terms of smoothness, like, I would say that it's maybe exactly the same as before, which makes sense frame rate wise. We haven't gained much. It's weird because the latency spikes pretty aggressively. So sometimes it's 24 milliseconds where it feels fine, like it's okay feeling, but then it jumps to 50 milliseconds and you can really feel the weight of the game. It feels so inconsistent. And we're not even getting that much frame rate for the additional latency being incurred going from 4x to 6x. I don't know, I feel like somebody needs to work on their multiplication tables here. And there's also a visual penalty. It's especially noticeable while driving over sunlit tarmac, but you can see that there's this distortion artifact over the tarmac, which wasn't there on 4x. It looks terrible. So now we have preset B running, which is supposed to be a higher fidelity version of it. Well, I've immediately noticed the same weird render issue on the tarmac. I don't know, it looks exactly the same as preset A to me, but you know, having said that, there are 6 pretend frames happening here, and aside from the tarmac thing and a bunch of softness, it actually looks surprisingly good. This is kind of impressive. So with that, we've seen what I would call the most feasible use case for frame gen, where you start with a reasonable frame rate, like 60 frames per second, and you jump it up to like 120 to get a little bit more smoothness. But with that, let's go way more ridiculous with it. So now we're going to jump it up to 1440p, and graphics-wise, we're going to use ray tracing overdrive so that we can really wring the neck of this little 5050. And I'm going to do that without resolution scaling. Okay, we may have gone a little bit far here because we're getting 5 frames per second and 550 milliseconds of latency. Now, unfortunately, Nvidia's latency overlay was so shook by what was going on here that it just didn't show up in the capture anymore. I could see it in person, but when I started editing the video, I noticed it was gone. So I went back and redid the tests so that I had some footage of the latency, but it means that the footage isn't going to exactly correspond with what I'm saying in the video, but this is why. I mean, I can't imagine that this isn't going to be devastation, but let's try and fix it with 6x frame gen. Okay, so we've gone to 30 frames per second. Okay, it says that there's just 500 milliseconds of latency, but it feels like my PC's on Mars. So, whip. That's awesome. Yeah, oh, we got 1,400 milliseconds of latency. Oh, yeah. The craziest part was when I went to go re-record this section to show you the latency with 6x FrameGen running over overdrive ray tracing settings, we hit over 3000 milliseconds of latency. I don't know what was going on here, but FrameGen was having a complete meltdown. Okay, we're gonna help it out a little bit. We're gonna turn on some upscaling and just go ultra performance. We're gonna throw it a bit of a bone here. And just like that, we've got 110-ish frames per second, but with 100 milliseconds of latency. And it looks atrocious. Oh my word. So now that we've managed to destroy the new FrameGen's spirit, let's try it out on a first-person shooter game, which I think theoretically could benefit a lot from it. So now I've moved over to Stalker 2, because Stalker 2 is a game that needs some help frame rate wise, and it's also a first-person shooter, which means it's more sensitive to latency than even something like Cyberpunk. Like, for all of the testing, or at least most of it I was doing with Cyberpunk, I was driving around, which honestly was me being kind of nice to it, because that isn't as latency sensitive as like a first-person shooter is. Now, I did want to test a game like Counter-Strike 2, but there wasn't any kind of competitive online games that has the 6x technology available yet, so Stalker 2 is our next best bet. Wow, it's actually doing better than I was expecting. So here, settings-wise, we've got 1080p medium settings with quality DLSS on. So this is something like settings-wise that I would use, and it's actually running very well. So we're starting off with about 12 to 10 milliseconds of latency. This is a good feeling game. Like, I would happily play Stalker like this. At which point I turned on Stalker's in-game FrameGen settings, which is just a toggle, which again stopped Nvidia's latency overlay from showing up in the screen capture for some reason. Okay, so with FrameGen just toggled on, we've jumped from about 100 frames per second to between 130 and 150, depending on where we look. So I'm assuming it's like 2x FrameGen, and well, this is actually pretty good. The game looks noticeably smoother, and we haven't gained that much latency. I mean, it's a reasonable amount. We've gone from between 10 and 12 to between like 14 and 20, but the latency is actually low enough that the game feels fine. Like, I can feel that there's something under the hood going on, but the additional smoothness is a big enough improvement that it's worth it to me. Next, I decided to try dynamic FrameGen with the target pegged to my monitor's max refresh rate of 240. Okay, so now it's actually giving us 240 frames per second, and our latency has jumped to actually not that much. Like, our latency is still really good. The reported latency is actually about the same as the much less aggressive FrameGen from earlier, which is very impressive. But in practice, it does feel a little bit heavier, and honestly, it doesn't look any smoother to me than the previous settings. Now, what is cool about dynamic is that it does tell you what multiplier it's using. So it's saying that it's just using 4x now. It's actually managing to maintain a decent latency. It's not nearly as noticeable as it was in Cyberpunk. Like, there's a little bit of it. Yeah, I can notice that it doesn't feel like 240 frames per second. I feel like when it was running at 150 frames per second, it was enough and the latency was lower. So I wouldn't use it this aggressively at all. But wow, the impact on the visuals isn't that big either. It's wild how variable the quality of the implementation is based on the game. And then finally I decided to try the new DLSS preset B, but with just a 3x multiplier. That gives us about 180 frames per second. Yeah, I mean, this is, again, like, very similar to the dynamic thing. I don't think it makes a huge difference. I still prefer when I just turned it on in the game and it was not very aggressive. I think that was still the best showing. And then finally, I went from 1080p medium settings being the base to 1440p medium settings being the base, which went less well. Yeah, you see, now it's not working anymore because our base starting latency is higher. There is a much more noticeable delta between the frame rate that my eyes are seeing and the latency. Oh yeah, see, now it feels like butt cheeks again. So clearly the starting point is very important, which means that footage that Nvidia keeps showing of Cyberpunk going from 20 frames per second to 400 or whatever is such a bad example because it's not the correct way to use the technology. Look, I get why Nvidia keeps making the fake frame number bigger because shareholders love that shit. But what I want them to do instead with this technology is give me more granular control of how many frames are being generated. I want to be able to set like 1.5x frame gen so that in game we're going from like 80 frames per second to 120 frames per second, which means the delta between expected latency and the visuals will be small enough for it to not make me vomit on myself. Besides, in my opinion, above 120 frames per second, the law of diminishing returns starts kicking your teeth in. And having to pay for that diminishing return with latency is a terrible deal. Which brings me to the end of the video. Thank you for watching. Let me know what you think of this take down below and subscribe on the way down there. And until the next video, thank you for watching. Bye-bye.